In the early 1960s, the U.S. found itself entangled in the seemingly intractable conflict in Vietnam. The seeds of discontent sown by French colonialism had sprouted into a full-blown crisis, and the domino theory held sway in American corridors of power. It was no longer enough to train South Vietnamese troops or provide financial aid. President Lyndon B. Johnson decided to commit ground troops. On August 2, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred. According to reports from the U.S. Navy, two destroyers, the Maddox and the Turner Joy, were attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Maddox had been monitoring North Vietnamese activities, and the Turner Joy had joined as backup. But the alleged attacks varied widely in official accounts, creating confusion even at the time. Claims of North Vietnamese aggression included attacks with machine guns and rockets. However, these reports lacked physical evidence. Years later, declassified documents revealed that the second attack may have been partly fabricated or misinterpreted. Despite these doubts, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7, 1964, granting President Johnson the authority to deploy military force in the area, and so began a major escalation in U.S. involvement. Initially, deployments were small, around 20,000 troops, but numbers swelled quickly. The end of the Vietnam War in 1975 marked the end of an era. The United States emerged from the conflict deeply changed. Its global standing was diminished, and domestic politics were fractured. The war had become a lightning rod for social and political tensions, exposing fault lines that ran deep through American society. Public trust in government eroded. The draft, seen as a symbol of an unjust and undemocratic system, was abolished, and a new cynicism defined American foreign policy. The war had drained the national coffers. In the post-war years, the U.S. shifted its focus primarily to domestic issues, investing heavily in social programs and infrastructure. The legacy of the Vietnam War continues to resonate today. It serves as a cautionary tale of how quagmires can ensnare even the most powerful nations, and the importance of understanding the complexities of a conflict before diving into a costly engagement. The war's impact on veterans remains a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict. The physical and psychological wounds of war often persist long after the battle's end. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., with its stark black granite and names of the fallen, stands as a powerful testament to their sacrifice. The Vietnam War was a pivotal event in the latter half of the 20th century. It reshaped the global political landscape, challenged long-held ideologies, and most importantly, profoundly impacted the lives of millions. Understanding this conflict is essential to comprehending the complexities of our modern world. But the story doesn't end here. We want to hear from you. Did you find this video informative? How did it change your perspective? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your feedback helps us improve and make history come alive for more people. Thank you for watching. The year is 1963, and South Vietnam is a mess. In recent years, the country has seen several coups d'etat, with rival political factions battling each other in the streets of Saigon. Despite being nominally an ally of the United States, the South Vietnamese government is unable to crush the communist Viet Cong insurgency. Instead, they are propped up by the U.S., who are attempting to contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. By late 1963, the political landscape in South Vietnam is so chaotic and unstable that the U.S. government becomes concerned that their own interests are not being protected. As things stand, if the South Vietnamese government falls, it will look like an American failure. But with rival factions too weak to ensure stability, the U.S. needs to find a solution. They can either put in a puppet leader, prop up one of the current factions, or intervene themselves. All of these options come with significant downsides. So what does the U.S. do? Well, they do something they have done before: depose the sitting leader and install a new government. On November 1, 1963, South Vietnamese generals assassinated their president, tragically ending Ngo Dinh Diem's life. With the political situation worsening in South Vietnam and an anti-American backlash in the U.S. government needed a way to stabilize the region and save face. All it would take was one spark. That spark comes in August of 1964 in the Gulf of Tonkin. But did it actually happen? Throughout the early 1960s, the United States supported covert operations against North Vietnam under Operation 3-4, a series of sabotage and espionage missions carried out by South Vietnamese commandos with U.S. support. These operations provoke increasing hostility from North Vietnam. Meanwhile, U.S. Navy ships conduct DeSoto patrols, intelligence-gathering missions in international waters off the coast of North Vietnam. These two operations, military raids and intelligence patrols, are dangerously close in time and space, blurring the lines between offensive and defensive actions. Then, on August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox was patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin when it encounters 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. A brief naval skirmish follows. No American sailors are killed, and the Maddox emerges relatively unscathed. The ship calls in air support from a nearby aircraft carrier, and the North Vietnamese boats are repelled. 2 days later, on August 4th, the Maddox and another destroyer, the Turner Joy, report a second attack. But this time, things are different. Radar readings are unclear. No solid evidence of enemy ships is found. It's dark. The weather is stormy. By the next day, even commanders on the scene are expressing doubts about whether an attack occurred at all. But in Washington, the Johnson administration seizes the moment. President Johnson addresses the nation. August 2nd, the aggressive missile boats of the Communist North Vietnamese Navy fired on the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy. They fired hundreds of rounds of blazing 88mm shells. Yet neither ship was crippled, nor was a single American man killed or wounded. With these bold claims, President Johnson goes before Congress asking for authorization to use military force in the area. Within hours of his speech, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passes with near unanimous support, giving the president authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. In essence, it's a blank check. Johnson can now escalate U.S. military involvement in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. Looking back, we now know the second attack likely never happened. It was either a mistake or a manipulation. But by then, the damage was done. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passes, and the door to full intervention swings wide open. Operation Rolling Thunder begins. By early 1965, North Vietnam is stepping up its support for the Viet Cong insurgency in the South. In response, President Johnson authorizes Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against targets in North Vietnam. What begins as a limited military response quickly expands. The goal is to demoralize the North, cut supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and pressure Hanoi into ending its support for the insurgency. But the bombing has the opposite effect. Rather than weaken the enemy's resolve, it hardens it. The U.S. drops hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs over Vietnam, more than it dropped during all of World War II in the Pacific. Cities, roads, forests, and farmland are turned into craters, villages are destroyed, civilians are killed, and yet the Viet Cong keep fighting. At first, the bombing campaign focuses on military targets, but as the weeks go on, entire regions are bombed simply for supporting the communist war effort. Bridges are destroyed, crops are decimated, and homes are turned to rubble. But despite the massive influx of bombs, U.S. pilots are unable to destroy North Vietnam's ability to wage war. Anti-aircraft missiles are in short supply, air defenses are minimal, and there are few good targets. If a pilot isn't willing to risk destroying a school, hospital, or civilian dwelling, he may have to return home without making an impact. Not only that, but the North Vietnamese people rally together and repair damaged infrastructure. After a bridge is destroyed, they rebuild it. When an entire village is leveled, they clear the rubble and start again. The bombing campaign is a failure. American boots on the ground. On March 8, 1965, the first official U.S. combat troops land at Da Nang. 3,500 Marines tasked with defending the airbase. This marks the transition from military advisors to direct combatants. More troops soon follow. By the end of 1965, the U.S. has over 180,000 soldiers in Vietnam. By 1966, the number will double. The war has become America's war. The mission is no longer just to support South Vietnam, it's to defeat the Viet Cong, destroy the communist infrastructure, and secure victory on the battlefield. But this is no conventional war. The enemy blends into the population, fights in small units, and uses hit-and-run tactics. Dense jungles, unfamiliar terrain, and a hostile environment make combat grueling and progress hard to measure. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong are bombed or burned. Entire hamlets are wiped out in the name of pacification. But these tactics often backfire. Civilians are caught in the crossfire. Survivors become radicalized, and the Viet Cong will simply disappear into the countryside, regroup, and return. The U.S. finds itself in a cycle of destruction without clear victories. To make matters worse, the presence of large numbers of American troops fuels the anti-war movement in the U.S. for those protesting. Sending more men into a jungle war that cannot be won is madness. If Johnson wins the 1966 elections, he plans to ramp up troop levels even further. This, however, is easier said than done. Much to his frustration, Americans have started dying. And if the body count keeps climbing, support for the war at home will dwindle. A war without front lines. By the end of 1965, the United States is deeply entangled in Vietnam. Bombs fall from the sky, troops patrol unfamiliar terrain, and American casualties begin to rise. What was once a small advisory mission has become a massive, open-ended war. There are no front lines, no clear victories, just jungles, rice paddies, booby traps, ambushes, and uncertainty. The American public, at first supportive, still believes in the righteousness of the mission, but doubts will soon emerge. President Johnson knows the war is unpopular and losing momentum. If he wants to get congressional approval to ramp up the war, he needs a victory, something big. That opportunity comes in February of 1968. The Tet Offensive will push America to the brink, but that's a story for another time. By 1966, America was in deep. What had started as a limited advisory mission had grown into a full-scale war with hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops deployed. The stakes were high, but the objectives were murky. Instead of securing victory, the United States found itself sinking further into what would become known as the quagmire, a swampy conflict from which there was no easy escape. The numbers game, body counts and kill ratios in a war without traditional front lines. The U.S. military needed new ways to measure success. They settled on statistics, especially the body count. Every operation, patrol, or firefight was followed by a count of enemy dead. Success wasn't measured by territory gained or strategic objectives achieved, but by how many Viet Cong or North Vietnamese soldiers were killed. General Westmoreland believed that the U.S. could wear down the enemy through attrition, that eventually the communists would lose so many men that they would have to give up. "We're reaching the crossover point," he often said, meaning the point at which the enemy was losing more soldiers than it could replace. But body counts were a poor metric. They were often inflated. Villagers and civilians caught in the crossfire were sometimes counted as enemy dead. In some cases, pressure from above led to outright falsification. The U.S. was winning the numbers game, but not the war. The expansion of U.S. troop presence throughout 1966 and into 1967, American troop levels continued to rise. By the end of 1967, there were over 485,000 U.S. military personnel in Vietnam. The scale of military operations grew with it. Massive search and destroy missions, like Operation Attleboro and Operation Cedar Falls, targeted Viet Cong strongholds, including the infamous Iron Triangle just north of Saigon. These operations involved tens of thousands of troops, heavy bombing, and the systematic destruction of villages suspected of sheltering enemy fighters. Civilians were evacuated, homes were burned, and jungles were flattened. But the Viet Cong, resilient and deeply rooted, often slipped away, only to return later. The war comes from the sky, B-52s, and the air campaign. While ground troops combed the countryside, the U.S. Air Force conducted a relentless bombing campaign against both North and South Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder, which had begun in 1965, intensified. B-52 bombers dropped payloads on supply routes, industrial targets, and suspected Viet Cong bases. Napalm jellied gasoline that stuck to skin and caused horrific burns, was widely used. In addition, the U.S. deployed Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant meant to strip the jungle of cover and expose enemy positions. It was sprayed over millions of acres of forest and farmland. What wasn't known, nor at least not admitted, was that Agent Orange contained dioxin, one of the most toxic substances known to science. The long-term effects were devastating. Vietnamese civilians and U.S. veterans alike would later suffer from cancer, birth defects, and a range of other illnesses due to chemical exposure. Entire generations were impacted. The enemy adapts, tunnels and guerrilla warfare, the Viet Cong and the People's Army of Vietnam. The regular army of North Vietnam were never able to match US firepower. Instead, they adapted. They built an elaborate network of tunnels, some stretching for miles, complete with living quarters, weapon storage, and hospitals. These underground cities allowed fighters to disappear after attacks and survive bombings. They set booby traps using sharpened bamboo stakes, tripwire grenades, and mines. US soldiers could never be sure which patch of jungle was safe. Even when the enemy wasn't visible, danger was ever present. Viet Cong fighters moved at night, attacked quickly, and faded into the terrain. They were often indistinguishable from civilians. This blurred line led to fear, paranoia, and tragic mistakes by American forces. The strain on US soldiers by 1967, the war was taking a heavy toll not just in casualties, but in morale and mental health. The average age of an American combat soldier in Vietnam was just 19 years old. Many were drafted, plucked from their lives in the US, and sent halfway around the world to fight a war they barely understood. They faced not just the enemy, but heat, disease, leeches, monsoons, and isolation. Jungle rot infected their skin. Malaria sapped their strength. The enemy was invisible, and the mission was unclear. Soldiers rotated in and out of combat zones in 12-month tours, which made unit cohesion difficult. Unlike World War II, where entire units fought together for years. Vietnam's individual rotation policy created instability and disconnection. Drug use became rampant. Marijuana was everywhere, and heroin began to spread. Some soldiers adopted a mantra: "Don't mean nothing." It was a coping mechanism in a war that increasingly felt senseless. Back home, growing dissent as the war dragged on, American casualties mounted. By the end of 1967, over 16,000 Americans had died, and the number continued to rise. Despite Westmoreland's optimism and government reassurances, victory seemed elusive. Back in the United States, dissent was growing. Anti-war protests spread on college campuses. Civil rights leaders, like Martin Luther King Jr., began to speak out against the war, arguing that it drained resources from domestic programs and disproportionately harmed African American and poor communities. Images from the war napalm victims, burning villages, coffins draped in American flags were broadcast into living rooms every night. The Vietnam War was the first televised war, and what Americans saw often contradicted what officials were saying. The calm before the storm by the end of 1967. President Johnson and his military commanders insisted the U.S. was making progress. General Westmoreland declared, "We have reached an important point where the end begins to come into view." But the enemy had other plans. In early 1968, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong would launch a massive, coordinated offensive across the South, an operation that would shatter illusions of victory and mark a turning point in the war. By the start of 1968, America had poured hundreds of thousands of troops and billions of dollars into Vietnam. Political leaders and generals assured the public that progress was being made, that the enemy was weakening, and that victory was on the horizon. But in January of that year, during what should have been a truce to celebrate the Vietnamese New Year Tet North, Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a stunning, wide-scale assault. It would change everything. What was the Tet Offensive? On January 30th, 1968, during Tet celebrations, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army launched a coordinated attack on more than 100 cities, towns, and military bases across South Vietnam. The targets included provincial capitals like Hue and Ban Mi Thuot, key U.S. bases like Bien Ho, and most shocking of all, the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. At around 2:45 a.m. in Saigon, 19 Viet Cong commandos attacked the U.S. Embassy compound. They blew a hole in the perimeter wall and engaged in a fierce gunfight with American Marines. Although the attackers were eventually killed or captured, the mere fact that they had breached the embassy grounds was a psychological bombshell. The American public had been told that the enemy was in retreat. Now they were watching gun battles on the evening news in the heart of the capital. The Battle of Hue, one of the most significant and bloodiest battles of the Tet Offensive, occurred in the ancient city of Hue for nearly a month. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces occupied the city. They executed thousands of civilians suspected of cooperating with the South Vietnamese government. When U.S. Marines and ARVN forces retook Hue, they faced a well-entrenched and determined enemy. House-to-house combat turned much of the city into rubble. Hue was eventually recaptured, but at a steep cost. more than 200 U.S. troops and thousands of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians died. Tactically a defeat, strategically a victory, militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the Communists. They suffered enormous casualties. Estimates range from 40,000 to 60,000 dead. They failed to incite a general uprising among the South Vietnamese population. No cities were held permanently, but strategically, it was a brilliant success. The shock of the attacks shattered the illusion that the U.S. and its allies were winning. It exposed the disconnect between what American officials were saying and what was actually happening. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted news anchor in America, traveled to Vietnam after Tet. Upon returning, he famously said, "It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate." President Lyndon B. Johnson, watching this broadcast, reportedly turned to his aides and said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Crisis in Washington, the Tet Offensive, sent political shockwaves through Washington. In March 1968, just weeks after Tet, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. He also announced a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and a renewed effort to seek peace talks. At the same time, Senator Robert F. Kennedy entered the presidential race, challenging the Johnson administration's war policy. Anti-war protests grew more intense and widespread, while faith in government and military leadership collapsed. America had lost not just a battle of arms, but the battle of public opinion. The psychological turning point, though, the U.S. military continued fighting after Tet. The offensive marked a turning point in the war. Confidence in a quick and decisive victory was gone. The anti-war movement gained unprecedented momentum. Military morale began to waver. Many Americans began asking, "What are we fighting for?" Troop levels would continue to increase briefly, but the political climate had shifted. What was once framed as a righteous fight against communism now looked to many like a futile and misguided intervention. The rise of Vietnamization. President Johnson, weary and embattled, handed the war over to his successor, Richard Nixon, who took office in January 1969. Nixon introduced a new policy: Vietnamization, the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops and the transfer of combat responsibility to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The idea was to end America's direct involvement while still preventing a communist victory. In theory, Vietnamization would allow the U.S. to exit gracefully. In practice, it masked a war that was spiraling deeper into tragedy and brutality. But for now, in the aftermath of Tet, one thing was clear: the war would never be the same again. In January 1969, Richard Nixon moved into the White House, promising to end the divisive war in Vietnam. Yet, as he worked to extricate the United States from Southeast Asia, Nixon expanded the conflict geographically and intensified the violence. So how did the Vietnam War go from being winnable to unwinnable for the U.S.? It's me. This is my channel. And here's how the Vietnam War got out of control. Entering the labyrinth, when Richard Nixon entered the White House in January 1969, the Vietnam War was at a crossroads. The Tet Offensive had shaken American confidence and shifted public opinion decisively against the conflict. 2 years earlier, in October 1967, 500,000 North Vietnamese soldiers had launched a surprise attack across South Vietnam. They seized numerous cities, including Hue, which turned into a battleground for the next month. Government buildings were destroyed. Homes were looted and burned. Thousands of civilians were massacred by communist troops. The Tet Offensive was a military defeat for the communists, but a public relations victory. It revealed the true cost of the war, especially for ordinary Vietnamese people. By the end of the offensive, some 27,000 North Vietnamese soldiers were dead, along with nearly 3,000 Americans. But Americans were growing weary of the bloodshed. They were frustrated by Washington's refusal to set a clear goal or timeline for the war, and they questioned why the conflict seemed never-ending. As Walter Cronkite, the most respected journalist of the era, later put it, "We have about reached the point where we must either ask what is our goal or get out." Nixon campaigned on a promise to achieve peace with honor, to end U.S. involvement in Vietnam without appearing to abandon South Vietnam or lose to communism. But what followed was not a swift exit. Instead, Nixon expanded the war, intensified the bombing, and widened the battlefield into neighboring countries, all while trying to quietly withdraw American troops. One analyst later described Nixon's strategy as Vietnamization, a policy that aimed to gradually withdraw American combat troops, strengthen the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, provide military aid, training, and support so that South Vietnam could fight its own war on paper. It was a logical plan. In practice, ARVN remained poorly led, plagued by corruption, and dependent on U.S. support. While U.S. troops began leaving, American firepower, especially in the form of airstrikes and military aid, continued at high levels. By the end of 1969, over 60,000 American troops had returned home. But the war was far from over. The secret bombing in March 1969, Nixon secretly ordered the first strikes in Cambodia, a neutral country bordering South Vietnam, known as Operation Menu. The bombing campaign targeted areas along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where North Vietnamese troops and supplies flowed. Nixon kept the operation secret from the American public hand, even from most members of Congress. Over the next 4 years, hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs were dropped, obliterating entire villages. Civilians died in large numbers, fueling local resentment and further destabilizing the region. The secret bombing marked a dangerous shift. The war was now spreading beyond Vietnam's borders. The invasion of Cambodia in April 1970, Nixon made a stunning announcement. U.S. and South Vietnamese forces had crossed the border into Cambodia. He justified the invasion by claiming it was necessary to destroy North Vietnamese bases and supply lines. But critics saw it as a betrayal of his promise to de-escalate the war. "This is not an invasion of Cambodia," Nixon declared. "The areas are completely occupied and controlled by North Vietnamese forces." But many Americans didn't buy it. Protests erupted across the country. On May 4, 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed student demonstrators. 4 students were killed and 9 others wounded. The Kent State shootings shocked the nation and symbolized the deep divisions over the war. Trust in the government plummeted. The anti-war movement surged, and Nixon's policies came under fierce scrutiny. The war in Laos, at the same time, the war was also spreading into Laos. Though officially neutral, Laos had long been a battleground in the shadows. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of roads and footpaths, snaked through Laos and Cambodia, enabling North Vietnam to supply its forces in the south. From 1964 to 1973, the U.S. dropped more bombs on Laos than it had on Germany and Japan during World War II, over 2 million tons. The campaign aimed to destroy the trail and stop communist supply lines. Instead, it devastated rural communities and left behind a legacy of unexploded ordnance that continues to kill civilians today. The question then becomes, how did things get so bad? Well, part of the problem was that neither side could achieve their ultimate goals without incurring unacceptable losses. The U.S. wanted to end its involvement in the war while preserving South Vietnam as an independent state. But as American troops withdrew, the North Vietnamese were emboldened to take the fight to the South Vietnamese. Meanwhile, North Vietnam hoped to unify the country under communist rule. But it could not do so without defeating the U.S., something it never truly achieved. So the fighting continued. But there's another reason why the war became unwinnable for the U.S. That's because while American military power was formidable, it was fundamentally limited. See, the Vietnam War pitted the United States against a determined enemy in a tropical jungle, far from America's shores. There were no grand sweeping victories to be had, and each engagement took a heavy toll. More and more Americans came to see the conflict as unwinnable, so they pressured their leaders to pull out. Nixon desperately tried to balance these competing pressures. He sought to end the war without giving in to his critics. He pulled out troops, but he bombed more than ever before. He negotiated peace deals, but he also secretly invaded neighboring countries. And all the while, the fighting dragged on and on. Nixon also pursued a psychological strategy known as the madman theory. The idea was to convince North Vietnam, its backers in the Soviet Union and China, that the U.S. president was volatile and capable of anything, even nuclear war, if provoked. To back up this image, Nixon dramatically escalated the bombing campaign. In 1972, after North Vietnam launched a major offensive, the Easter Offensive, Nixon responded with massive airstrikes. This included Operation Linebacker and later the brutal Christmas bombing campaign in December 1972 when B-52s rained destruction on Hanoi and Haiphong for 12 straight days. The scale of devastation shocked the world. Cities were leveled, civilian casualties soared, but the North Vietnamese did not surrender. That brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the flaws in the Paris Peace Accords. While the bombs fell, negotiators sat at the table in Paris trying to hammer out a peace agreement. Talks had been ongoing since 1968, but progress was slow and contentious. The main sticking points: the future role of the North Vietnamese Army in South Vietnam, the political status of the Viet Cong, whether South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thu would remain in power. In January 1973, a deal was finally reached. The Paris Peace Accords called for a ceasefire, withdrawal of all U.S. forces, return of American prisoners of war, recognition of South Vietnam's sovereignty, but the agreement was deeply flawed. North Vietnamese troops were allowed to remain in the South. The Viet Cong were not disarmed, and the ARVN was left to defend the country alone. The U.S. had secured peace with honor, but it was a fragile peace at best. Ultimately, the U.S. failed to achieve its goals in Vietnam because its strategy was fundamentally flawed. Nixon attempted to limit the war, but instead he expanded it. He sought to de-escalate the conflict, but instead he intensified the bombing. And he wanted to end the war without losing face. But his peace agreements left South Vietnam vulnerable. As the fighting dragged on, the United States grew weary of the conflict. Public opinion turned against the war, and by the early 1970s, the U.S. was ready to cut its losses and withdraw. Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces in 1975, and soon after, the country was reunited under communist rule. If you want to learn more about the Vietnam War, check out the series in the description below. Thanks for watching. And now, back to the program. On January 1973, the United States and North Vietnam had signed the Paris Peace Accords, officially ending American military involvement in Vietnam. For many Americans, the war was finally over. Troops came home, prisoners of war were released. The long, bloody conflict seemed to be winding down. But for the Vietnamese, both North and South, the war was far from finished. After the Paris Peace Accords, an uneasy truce, the Paris Peace Accords were meant to establish a lasting ceasefire between North and South Vietnam. But almost immediately, violations began on both sides. The North Vietnamese left approximately 150,000 troops in South Vietnam, refusing to withdraw. The Viet Cong maintained their political presence and control in many rural areas. The South Vietnamese government, under President Nguyen Van Thu, launched attacks to reclaim contested territory. Though the United States had pledged continued financial and military support to South Vietnam, it had withdrawn all combat troops. What remained were advisors and logistical support staff, around 50,000 personnel. But the war didn't stop. It simply changed shape. America's waning support, back in the United States, public and political appetite for further involvement in Vietnam had evaporated. The country was consumed by the unfolding Watergate scandal, which would eventually lead to President Nixon's resignation in 1974. With Nixon gone, President Gerald Ford took office. But Ford lacked the political capital to continue sending billions in aid to South Vietnam. In 1974, Congress cut military assistance dramatically, without U.S. air power, logistical support, or financial aid. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, struggled to maintain its defense. Meanwhile, North Vietnam saw a historic opportunity. The final North Vietnamese offensive, in early 1975, North Vietnamese leadership launched a massive, coordinated military campaign to end the war once and for all. Their goal, to capture Saigon and unify the country under communist rule. The offensive began in the Central Highlands with a swift victory in Ban My Thuot. Panic spread, ARVN units collapsed or fled. South Vietnamese leadership made a catastrophic decision to abandon key cities like Hue and Da Nang, hoping to consolidate forces around Saigon. This withdrawal turned into a chaotic retreat. Hundreds of thousands of civilians flooded roads, trying to escape the advancing communist forces. Refugee columns were bombed. Entire units of ARVN disintegrated. The collapse of South Vietnam. By April 1975, North Vietnamese forces were closing in on Saigon. President Thu resigned and fled the country. the government crumbled. The ARVN, demoralized and outgunned, offered little resistance. On April 29th, the U.S. launched Operation Frequent Wind. The final evacuation of American personnel and at-risk South Vietnamese citizens, helicopters lifted people off rooftops and from the U.S. Embassy compound. Thousands were left behind. Scenes of chaos unfolded, desperate civilians scaling embassy walls. U.S. Marines holding back crowds, helicopters pushed off aircraft carriers to make room for more refugees. On April 30th, 1975, a North Vietnamese tank crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. South Vietnam surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. The human cost. The Vietnam War had exacted an extraordinary toll. Over 58,000 Americans died. More than 150,000 were wounded. An estimated 2 million Vietnamese civilians died. Around 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters, and 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers were killed. The physical and emotional scars were profound. Millions of Vietnamese were displaced. The countryside was littered with unexploded ordnance. Forests were decimated by defoliants like Agent Orange. The U.S. suffered a generation of veterans who returned to a society that was divided, disillusioned, and sometimes hostile toward them. For the South Vietnamese who remained behind, retribution came quickly. The new Socialist Republic of Vietnam sent hundreds of thousands of people to re-education camps. Many perished. Others fled the country, sparking the Boat People crisis as tens of thousands risked their lives escaping Vietnam by sea. A legacy of defeat. For the United States, the Vietnam War ended in what many perceived as defeat a superpower brought low by a poor, determined, and ideologically driven adversary. It shattered the myth of American invincibility and sowed deep distrust in government institutions. The term Vietnam became shorthand for foreign entanglement, quagmire, and policy failure. The U.S. military would spend decades recovering from the war's psychological and political trauma. And American foreign policy would be shaped for years to come by the lessons real or imagined of Vietnam. In hindsight, the Paris Peace Accords proved to be a naive attempt to end a war that America never fully entered. Even during the height of U.S. involvement, many Americans doubted the wisdom of fighting a war in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Accords did not end the war, but merely postponed its conclusion. North Vietnam's supreme confidence in their ultimate victory was evident in their refusal to withdraw from South Vietnam. While the United States negotiated in good faith, the North Vietnamese viewed the talks as a chance to buy time, regroup, and ultimately triumph. With American support waning, South Vietnam was left vulnerable. Hanoi gambled that the U.S. Congress would not support military intervention to save Saigon. They won that bet. The war ended not with a decisive battle, but with the slow collapse of South Vietnam. This defeat had a profound impact on America's global standing. Despite the human cost and global implications, the Vietnam War remains shrouded in controversy. Was it a tragedy that could have been avoided? A necessary but futile effort? Or an opportunity for America to have forged a meaningful alliance in a turbulent region? We want to hear from you, our viewers. Please leave your comments below. We may edit and publish some of them in the comments section of this video. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it on social media. Subscribe to this channel to be notified when new videos are published. You can also watch this video on our website or on other platforms. Thanks for watching. The year is 1975. The last American helicopters lifted off from the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, evacuating the last Americans as North Vietnamese forces closed in on the city. The airlifted hums fade into the sounds of a nation divided. In the distance, a new flag rises over the capital. For the U.S. government, the evacuation is a success. But as the dust settles, we realize there is no victory lap. The war may be over, but for the men and women who fought in it, the battles will continue. The Vietnam War would end up being a defining moment in American history, creating a generation of veterans who would face struggles that echoed long after the final shots were fired. I'm your host, and you're watching this channel. Join me today as we explore the experiences of the Vietnam veteran, the triumphs, the tragedies, and the lasting impact of a war that touched every aspect of the American experience. When the last American helicopters left Saigon in April 1975, the war may have ended for the U.S. government, but it was far from over for the men and women who had fought in it. The Vietnam War created a generation of veterans, whose struggles would continue long after the battlefield fell silent through trauma, social alienation, and years of unanswered questions. But before we get into it, if you love anything to do with history and learning about historical events, make sure you subscribe. Coming home to a divided nation, unlike World War II veterans who were celebrated as liberators and heroes, many Vietnam veterans returned to a country that was deeply divided over the war. Protests had rocked the nation throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. Images of burned villages, napalm victims, and civilian casualties had flooded American television screens. Public trust in the government was at an all-time low, and many Americans had come to view the war as a moral and strategic failure. As a result, Vietnam veterans came home to a cold reception. Some were ignored, others were scorned. Many found that even friends and family didn't want to talk about the war at all. There were no parades, no national celebration, no real homecoming. Some veterans were even blamed for the war called baby killers, or portrayed as broken and dangerous. This stigma added to the emotional wounds they carried from the battlefield. Post-traumatic stress and the hidden wounds, many returning soldiers suffered from what was then a poorly understood condition. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, they carried vivid memories of ambushes, firefights, booby traps, and the loss of comrades. Nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, depression, and substance abuse were common. But at the time, few resources existed for veterans struggling to cope with psychological trauma. Some turned to alcohol or drugs. Others withdrew from society. Suicide rates among Vietnam veterans soared. For decades, the psychological toll of the war went largely unacknowledged by both the government and the public. It was until the 1980s that PTSD was officially recognized by the American Psychiatric Association, and efforts began to provide mental health care to veterans. Agent Orange, the silent killer, another scar left by the war, came from exposure to Agent Orange, the chemical defoliant used by the U.S. military to destroy jungle cover and crops in Vietnam. Many veterans were exposed to the chemical often without knowing its long-term effects. Years later, they began suffering from a range of illnesses: cancers, skin diseases, diabetes, neurological disorders, and more. Children of exposed veterans were also born with birth defects. Initially, the government denied the connection. Veterans had to fight a long legal and political battle to gain recognition and treatment. It wasn't until 1991 that the Agent Orange Act was passed, allowing the Department of Veterans Affairs, or VA, to provide benefits to those affected. But for many, the damage had already been done. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial. A Wound and a Healing in 1982. After years of advocacy, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was unveiled in Washington, D.C. It was a bold and emotional monumental black granite wall inscribed with the names of more than 58,000 Americans who died in the war. The design, created by architect Maya Lin, was controversial at first. Some critics called it too somber, too abstract, or even unpatriotic. But for veterans and families, the memorial quickly became a place of healing. Visitors left flowers, notes, dog tags, and photos. They traced names with paper and pencil. They wept. The wall gave many veterans a place to confront their grief, honor their comrades, and find some measure of peace. Over time, it helped the nation begin to reconcile with the legacy of Vietnam. The cultural legacy of the war, the Vietnam War, also left a profound impact on American culture. It became the subject of films, books, songs, and television shows that reflected the pain, confusion, and complexity of the conflict. Movies like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, and Born on the 4th of July explored the war's brutality, its moral ambiguity, and its aftermath. These films were raw, often critical, and deeply personal. Writers like Tim O'Brien, author of The Things They Carried, offered haunting portraits of the emotional weight soldiers carried home. Through art and storytelling, Americans began to process the war in a way that history books and official reports never could. And now, we move to our final chapter. Veterans today. Support, struggle, and service. Today, many Vietnam veterans are in their 70s and 80s. While many have found stability, others still struggle with health issues, homelessness, and trauma. The Department of Veterans Affairs has expanded its services, but long wait times, underfunding, and bureaucratic challenges remain. Nonprofit organizations and community groups also play vital roles in supporting veterans. Many Vietnam veterans became advocates working to ensure that future generations of soldiers are never forgotten or abandoned as they once felt they were. Some helped lead efforts to support troops returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, ensuring they had the resources and recognition they deserved. Their legacy is not just one of war, but of resilience, advocacy, and brotherhood. The Vietnam War continues to resonate in American memory, not just as a conflict half a world away, but as a defining moment in the nation's history. It raised fundamental questions about courage, sacrifice, duty, and the cost of war. For the veterans, it is a legacy of resilience, of confronting the demons of war and working to ensure that no one forgets the sacrifices made. Their stories are a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of community. As we remember and honor these brave souls, let us also commit to understanding, supporting, and caring for those who carry the invisible wounds of war. They deserve nothing less than our deepest gratitude and our unwavering support. And that's all we have for today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please like and share for more great content. We'll see you next time. As the dust settled from the war in Vietnam, the United States was left with not just grief, but a sobering awareness of what had gone wrong. Over the decades, scholars, generals, journalists, and politicians have dissected the war to understand its causes, its failures, and what lessons could be drawn for future American foreign policy. The credibility gap. One of the most lasting consequences of the Vietnam War was a profound loss of trust in government. Throughout the 1960s, U.S. officials told the American people that victory was near, that progress was being made, and that the enemy was weakening. Yet, the reality on the ground told a different story, one of stalemates, heavy casualties, and a determined enemy. This disconnect between public statements and battlefield realities came to be known as the credibility gap. It eroded faith in political leaders and institutions and fueled a wave of skepticism that extended beyond the war to include Watergate, the CIA, and domestic policies. In Vietnam, the government learned that truth matters and that deception, even with good intentions, can backfire catastrophically. The power and role of the media of Vietnam was often called the First Television War. Journalists and camera crews had unprecedented access to the battlefield. Images of wounded soldiers, crying children, and burning villages were broadcast nightly into American homes. This media exposure played a critical role in shaping public opinion. It revealed the war's brutality and futility, contradicting official narratives of progress. Some military leaders later accused the press of undermining the war effort, while others argued that the media simply exposed what the government tried to hide. Regardless of interpretation, the Vietnam War changed forever how conflicts would be reported and consumed by the public. The limits of military power, the Vietnam War forced the United States to confront a difficult truth. Military might alone cannot guarantee victory, especially in a war driven by ideology, nationalism, and asymmetrical tactics. Despite overwhelming firepower, advanced technology, and global resources, the U.S. failed to achieve its goals. Why? The enemy was embedded in the population, making traditional warfare ineffective. South Vietnam's government lacked legitimacy and popular support. The war was viewed by many Vietnamese not as a Cold War struggle, but as a fight for national liberation. America's failure to understand these dynamics led to costly miscalculations, the War Powers Act, and congressional oversight in response to the unchecked escalation of the Vietnam War. Congress passed the War Powers Act of 1973. This legislation aimed to limit the president's ability to commit U.S. forces to armed conflict without congressional approval. Under the act, the president must notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying troops and must withdraw forces within 60 days if Congress does not authorize the action. The War Powers Act represented an attempt to reassert democratic control over war-making powers and prevent another Vietnam-style quagmire. Lessons for future conflicts. The lessons of Vietnam have echoed through every subsequent American military engagement, from Grenada and Somalia to Iraq and Afghanistan. Avoid open-ended commitments without clear objectives. Understand the cultural and political context before intervening. Ensure public and congressional support for major conflicts. Plan not just for combat, but for what happens after the fighting ends. know when to disengage. In some cases, these lessons were heeded. In others, they were forgotten or ignored, often with tragic consequences. Reconciliation with Vietnam. In the decades after the war, the United States and Vietnam slowly moved toward reconciliation. In 1995, diplomatic relations were fully normalized. Trade and tourism flourished. Former enemies became economic partners. American veterans returned to Vietnam, not as soldiers, but as tourists, and volunteers' memorials now stand in both countries. Students study the war from multiple perspectives. The two nations share a complex but evolving relationship, one built on both pain and healing. The human legacy. Ultimately, the Vietnam War is more than a historical episode. It's a story of human endurance, of lives lost and forever changed, of choices made in fear and ambition, of mistakes admitted and denied. It is the story of the Vietnamese civilians who lived through 2 decades of conflict, the soldiers on all sides who followed orders, questioned them, and sometimes broke under them, the protesters who demanded peace, the journalists who told uncomfortable truths, the policymakers who tried to balance ideals with realpolitik, and the generations who followed, striving to make sense of the trauma left behind. Conclusion: a cautionary tale. The Vietnam War remains a defining chapter in the history of the United States and Southeast Asia. It is a cautionary tale of the dangers of hubris, the complexities of foreign intervention, and the resilience of those caught in the crossfire. Its memory continues to shape how we think about power, patriotism, sacrifice, and what it truly means to fight for freedom. In the jungles of Vietnam, far from American shores, the United States learned some of its most difficult lessons, not just about war, but about itself.